Hi, welcome to another Consuki Conversations, and I'm Rob Balfour.
And I'm Neve Rose.
And we have a really, really interesting guest with us this evening, and I'll let him introduce himself and why he's here to chat to us about all things activism and changing the world for male survivors and female survivors as well in university contexts.
Hi, so my name's Olumide Ajulo. I am a psychotherapist. I work as a counselling team manager at Leeds Beckett University, and I also have a small private practice. What's brought me here today, actually, and I'll tell a bit more about it. I met Rob, actually trying to find some training, some legitimate training on how to effectively work with male sexual assault survivors. We ended up having a really interesting conversation and collaborating on an initiative to help male sexual assault survivors that are at university access appropriate support. So that's how we came into each other's orbit. And so I'm here today to talk more about this stuff.
I thought it'd be interesting to talk about kind of like how you think university counselling services are able to support male survivors and just like university students in general. I feel like there's kind of a lot of discourse around support for students within a university context and where the responsibility lies. So it'd be interesting to kind of hear your perspective on that and how you feel the work that you're doing is like supporting the students.
Yeah, especially with the recent court case. Sort of as a service, we've been really thinking about what is our role and also what isn't our role. And with a university service, I think it's really important to understand that we're not the NHS and we're not statutory services. So there are limits to what we can do, and I think actually is appropriate to do. So one thing I've always said is at times, because I've worked at the Leeds Beckett, and I've also worked at college as well. So I've worked in psychotherapy and education for a number of years. And the issue that can sometimes happen is what a mental health and counselling service would do can sometimes feel at odds with an institution or at odds with an education institution, because one is looking at what's best for the student in terms of their mental health, and sometimes the education system can be the thing that's causing the mental health issue. Ultimately, the education system is we need to get this person through their degree, and I don't mean that in a bad way. That person wants to get that degree, they want to get that diploma, they want to get that master's. So the university is there to help them get through, and so what I see my job is to strategically think about how can we help students not only with their mental health but get that degree, the reason they've come to university. And so as a leadership, we've really been talking about this and making sure that that's at the forefront of our work. I love long-term work. I love working with clients for years. I don't think that's appropriate for a student for a university setting, because you build that dependence when actually it's supposed to be a place for them to take off into the rest of their lives. And the goal is to help them get through their degree. And if there's something getting in the way of that, that's where we step in. And so it's making sure providing a place where they can optimize their learning, optimize their social experience in that university setting. There may be cases that people are acutely ill, and we've seen people come to us and they're experiencing the beginnings of psychosis and things like that, where our job is to signpost them and help them get to the right service. I don't think we should be taking on statutory service roles and statutory service jobs, because that's where the lines get blurred. And I think with this discourse with what universities and education systems are responsible for. I think that's where the rub can be sometimes. So.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I think it's quite a complex relationship that students have with the institutions that they go to, because in a way you feel like they should be responsible for your well-being, but at the same time it is an education institution, not like a support service. So you obviously get the support within like teams like yourself, but it's kind of like, where is the line, and when should it become about kind of like signposting and still supporting the students, but actually sending them to kind of more specialist services that can support them alongside their studies. And I definitely think it is a very complex situation. I don't know what your take on it, Rob, is.
I mean, picking up what both of you are saying, really, from my perspective about things, is I always remember that people have to go back into reality. And I'm not saying counselling sessions are not reality, but they're a very special reality where you're held in a way that hopefully you're getting lots of a kind of attunement to another human being is just seeing you. That isn't normally the world that we're in, isn't it? Especially if you're transitioning through a university degree, because it is a machine to get you through, hopefully a nice empathic machine if you've got lecturers and things. So even the best services in our sector, which is sexual violence sector, the majority of them are now capping at 2026 maximum sessions. And waiting lists are growing. And you can sit and hold somebody and create a kind of beautiful person-centered event for them, and that's great. So everything should be person-centered, shouldn't it, if you're working with vulnerable people? But in the end, they have to go back. And so that's why I chose in our service, and other people are using it as well, as a framework that tries to build a process for people within the therapeutic sessional package, aims and objectives to not in a pure CBT kind of thing, but really, they have to go back and they have to kind of function. So you've helped them out of the river downstream from whatever's created the situation, but they cannot sit on a mountain and escape the river. They can't because that's life, the river is life, they have to go back. So I think what you're saying about the university context perfectly aligns with that. They've put all that time in, their parents' expectations, their own expectations, all the hard work to get there. Crisis comes for them for whatever reason. You want to get them over the line so that they get their degree and they're successful, and then they can do extra long-term work if they need it and do all the rest of it. But they need to finish, don't they, as much as possible, if you can help them to do that. That'd be my perspective.
Yeah. I also think, this is something I've been thinking about over the generations, attitudes towards what is expected from university has changed. I think back to when I was at university 20 plus years ago, it was just a very different time and experience. You were given the message, you are here to get your degree, you're an adult, and we're not here to hold your hand. You need to do things. And I'm not saying all of it was right, and that's a very complex conversation. So I don't want to say people are being mollycoddled or anything like that. But it's just this is a bit of a new phenomena where there is a higher expectation of university services, and the debate is where it's right and where it may be we need to think about it a bit more. But as you said, it's a complex conversation. So I'm just thinking, as someone sort of at a strategic level needs to think about this change and how we ride this change and help students in the right way.
I mean, my view is that the populations of students, they're not the same population. I mean, I first thought about going to university over 40 years ago. So it took me a long time to get there. So in the end, it was for about, it was about 15 years ago that I actually went back. Actually, 20 years ago when I kind of really looked at it and did a little bit of it. But I nearly went back 40 years ago. And they were very different places 40 years ago. They're much smaller for a start. My sixth form, that school, I was, I remember telling me the other day that The sixth form in my school had maybe 20 students in it, because only 20 students out of my school did A levels and went on to, not because there weren't lots of students who could do A levels. You just didn't require A levels to do lots of things. A levels were the pathway into universities, and many people didn't do university. They did their O levels, and O levels were enough to get you into the Royal Air Force, for instance, to become a fighter pilot. You didn't need A levels and a degree to be a fighter pilot. You could actually become a jet fighter pilot in the Royal Air Force on four O levels, in theory. So, and most people only did 4 or 5, maybe 6 O levels. I mean, people weren't doing 10 O levels. They weren't doing all these A levels on top of it. It was a different world, and you could reach things with less, because you kind of went on to do it.
Yeah.
Now the expectation is that you have to have the equivalent of 10 A levels, or 10 O levels, and 3 A levels with pluses on them at the end. And that just wasn't the world. So, and there was lots more opportunities for people. So I think it's a different population. Neve's generation is a different population, aren't they? They kind of have different expectations, different pressures upon them.
Yeah.
They have to pay for the thing in the first place, whereas my generation didn't have to do that if I'd gone back 40 years ago. So,
whereas I was just around, I just missed it. I was like, dang it. But yeah, it is. But the thing that really strikes me, thinking about mental health, is the number of ways universities contact students: email, social media, just the number of emails students get, everything. So I'm finishing my master's, so I came back. So when I did my first degree, you didn't get emails; it was all on pinboard. You handed in your essay, paper, you hand it in. Now you're getting emails, you have to hand it in on the computer. It's just another world, and the number of emails you're getting, it can be really overwhelming. And the pressure, I feel that a number of people got their first degree, but now you have to, if you want to get in certain jobs, you have to have a master's.
Mm-hmm.
You can't get to those higher jobs with just a degree. So the pressure to succeed, a number of the students that I'm seeing, that I'm not going to make it, I'm not going to make it, and you're having to help them work through that, in a therapeutic way. And a number of international students, they've got that pressure to succeed. So it's a very different world and very different pressures, and that's what makes it complex. It's very easy to say, oh, they need to have more resilience, but they have very different pressures and very different experience that needs different support, and it's looking at what does that look like.
Yeah, I think as well as more people have access to university now, there's more kind of pressure to go to university from a younger age too. Like kids are in secondary school, maybe year 9, choosing their GCSEs, actually thinking about what degree they might do in however many years' time. And it's kind of like building and building and building to this university experience. It's like I remember my sixth form experience. I wasn't interested in university at all, but it was all they talked about. We had time in our timetable to prepare for university, and it's like it's good that you have that support, but at the same time there's a lot of pressure to actually get into university, and a lot of pressure for that to be the path that people take. Like you see a lot, I think maybe in the past couple of years, a lot of apprenticeships have actually started to come up as well. So like the options are kind of opening back up again. But from my school experience, university was so highly pressured. I think that's why I kind of actually pushed back against it, because I was like, well, what if that's not what I want? I mean, I did end up going to university just a few years later, but I was able to make that decision on my own then, which was like nice. And I think as well that kind of pressure, then you get to university as a young person, if you're going straight into university at 18 and you've had all this pressure, and you get to university, and then there's the social side of it that's pressure, and then kind of keeping up on the work. There's a lot. It's a highly pressurized time, I think, for a lot of students. So it's kind of inevitable, I think, that people end up with like needing this extra support. But yeah, it's an interesting kind of balance to strike between supporting students, but also kind of helping them to develop that independence that they need. Because, like you say, the university isn't there for life. It's kind of to help them take off into their life.
Yeah.
So yeah, very interesting.
I think my school, there are 300 or 400 in that sixth form now, because the way the system has changed and the pressures on them all to kind of succeed and things. So, and then if you go back to where we're coming from, really, is if you're bringing a sexual abuse experience from childhood, whether you're male or female, and you're bringing that to the university in a world that isn't so silent about it, in relation to younger people are much more able to talk about it, is then you get all those pressures. You're also emerging as an adult because you're younger, because you're told you have to go 18. It's 18, 19, you're going to university. That, for somebody, for me, that seems very young to be doing that, going to university. Maybe in my generation, you would have gone when you were 20, 23, you might have gone off and done something and then gone to university. You weren't going directly there often. So that seems a change as well, and the different routes.
Yeah. And just thinking about some of the students that I've worked with and the defense mechanisms that they've got in place, you've experienced child sexual abuse, you have your way of coping. So you have your place of safety, you're living with your family, you have all these things in place. Then you go to a completely new context with completely new set of rules. You're trying to navigate different things, potentially a lot of different situations that could be really emotionally activating and cause dysregulation. And you're trying to get a degree at the same time. That's a really difficult place to be. And I think it's in those moments that's where us as a service can really help, because we can help you process what's going on, build up new appropriate ways of coping, and get that degree, because that's what you're here for. And you've had something horrendous happen, and actually let us help you with that, so that we can get you your degree. And so it's not, the two things can meet, that there is an emotional need and there's a degree to get, and we can find that place where both meet.
Find the middle ground.
I think, that really has to be within the context. This is my perspective from outside of that environment. And having gone through university and done kind of undergraduate and a master's, is that, you are pretty much on your own in some ways, even though you get bombarded with all the information streams and all the stuff you have to do. You're kind of even at undergraduate level, you're somewhat on your own, unless you've got a cohort of students that you kind of connect to in your own year and stuff. But at master's level, it's nice to have cake and whatever, but you're basically on your own. So you're having to cope with all of that. And then all the doubts that we all have, that whether you're being abused or not, about whether you're good enough to get through all of that things. So all of that kind of going on, you want people to succeed, don't you? Even with all those injuries that they're carrying from life. So they get over the line, and then they might still have a lot of work to do to deal with the injury, which is what I would call the abuse.
Yeah.
But they've got something in the bag that they can use further downstream, which is their degree. So they're not because if you then fall out of that, what's that like now? Halfway through, you bail out and you're owing 20 grand, 30 grand, or whatever it is. And then you have to think about coming back in the future to kind of repick that, even though, because the pressure on them must be horrific when they've kind of dived into it. So, for the amount of debt and stuff and the expectations that they may never have told their parents about the abuse in childhood. They may not have told anybody. And we've had a couple of cases in the last year or so of young guys who've gone to university and they're exploring their sexuality, for example, and they've gone to bars or clubs and they've met people who've exploited them and kind of taken, they've been spiked in one case, they kind of be invited back and they think these people are really, cool, and they think they're finally growing up, and then the abuse repeats itself because they kind of find, and that's not about them. That's just because they're, in vulnerable situations. And we know spiking is not uncommon in environments for students. So for anybody, for these kind of more stuff. So I think universities personally have a kind of major duty of care. These are not widgets going through a machine to produce a piece of paper at the end of it. They're human beings that are growing and developing as people who are critical about the world, but they have to understand themselves to really connect to it and be connected to themselves to really understand how to be truly kind of open-minded to knowledge, because they have to be knowledge themselves.
I was going to ask about students seeking support. Like, do you see kind of like a big kind of influx of students seeking support, or is it a lot of like, do people are they aware of the services that they have to support them? Is there, are you seeing quite a lot of students that are needing support? Or is it does it fluctuate?
Yeah, so I would say we see a lot of students. We see sort of the trend stays the same. It tends to sort of start to really ramp up in October through to December, and then February, and then starts to sort of die down end of May, June. But what we're seeing is sort of the starting point in September is higher. Some people are coming in immediately,
Right.
they want the support. And also, I think the level of complexity has increased over the years. Sort of what was we're seeing a lot, like, so I manage the counselling team, but in our wellbeing service there's a mental health team. So anyone where there's an element of risk, either with suicide or self-harm or eating disorder, that is getting towards that threat of life level, we have people that support with that. And then we have different ways of supporting students. So but it feels like the complexity's increased. So it's thinking about the best way to help them. And a number of statutory services, there's a long waiting list. That's no secret. And unfortunately, third sector offers are reducing it feels like by the month. So a lot of the places we would refer students to, unfortunately, those avenues are now closed. So we're having to think how best to support students, because I don't always think counselling's right for people, or counselling may be right for someone, but a short-term model isn't right for them, because what they need to discuss needs longer. And so to open something up and close it, or not be able to close it, that we've got to think about duty of care. Are we just going to take away the defences that someone has, that though they may not be functioning the best, but actually it will be better than taking that away and they haven't got anything? So it's thinking about, what does this person actually need? And so, we do have some long waiting lists, which we've worked through. But we do also have high demand for our service. And at the same time, we're continuing to have more and more people access our service. I think as mental health is more and more in the conversation at various ages, various generations, more and more people are wanting to access it. For
I was
free.
going to say about that actually, with the people kind of coming in September and wanting the services straight away. Maybe it is because there's like that more awareness of mental health, and then also, like you say, thinking, oh well, I'm within this institution now that I can get some free counselling from. So it's like going straight in, rather than maybe students struggling for like the first month and then finding their feet and learning about the university and finding the information they need and knowing that it's there. I think the mental health is definitely it's talked about so much more than it ever has been. There's so much more awareness, and we need the services to kind of meet that demand now that people are, because there's like a lot of encouragement about people speaking out about their mental health and getting help, but then because people are empowered to do that, there's more demand, and it's like services are overwhelmed. I think that's across the board really. NHS, statutory services, and universities. I don't know. Hopefully, new government, more funding. That would be the best kind of solution, I think, at the minute to those kind of issues. But do you see kind of a mix of people coming forward? Do you think that, or do you think like more populations of people are getting reached easier, in terms of like, do you get a lot of diversity of people coming in, or is it like more women, more men?
Yeah, no. So we do get more women. And funnily enough, my master's dissertation is on men's attitude towards mental health and how that then affects them accessing university mental health services. So I'm sort of in the throes of analysing data I've got from that.
Wow.
And I think traditionally, and it's still the case if we look at our data, it's skewed to more women accessing service than men. You'll get different ethnic groups and ethnic groups within our country and ethnic groups in terms of international students.
Yeah.
So there is a mix. I think sort of on the whole, what we find is most students start to come to us mid-October, November, because they've had that chance to settle in. They're starting to get the assignments. They're starting to get overwhelmed, and then that's when they come to us. I think therapy, with some things, elements of access and finance benefit those who have it. So if you have money, if you have, I want to be very careful with the language that we use because there's a lot of language that's thrown around. But I'll just say money. If you have the resources, you can hire a private therapist who can work with you for as long as you want to work with them. And I work with some private clients. If you don't have, we have a number of students who don't have money, who can't afford a private counsellor, can't afford a private therapist, so they're on waiting lists. So the ones that are on waiting lists are because they can't afford, but some of them are in real need. So we're stuck in that cycle of, and it's not to say that if you have money you don't need therapy, but it's a case of you have options. And that doesn't mean your problems are any less. It just means you can afford to be seen quicker. Whereas if you don't have the resources, you've just got to go with what's available. So for me personally, I'm hoping that this new government will put more money behind services so that the demand can be met, because there's some people with real need. And it seems that certain demographics are always get the short end of the stick. And we really need to do something about that. So yeah.
I think
that's really interesting to hear about your dissertation topic as well. That's if you have any kind of facts that you've learned from that, that'd be really interesting to hear.
Yeah. Oh gosh, what have I learned? So it's interesting because so one of the things I'm looking at, I looked at race, I looked at class. So I asked people to identify what class they would call themselves, and age. I wanted to look at those because I think, especially in this country, class is a big factor. And I don't think, looking at the literature, it's never really looked at that, and there's not much literature on men and university mental health services. I think I'm seeing some correlation between the class people identify as and their attitudes towards mental health. So I got quite a few responses. So it was going to be a qualitative report, but it's going to be a quantitative report now because I've got quite high numbers. So looking at the data, that's an interesting one, and also different attitudes depending on where they've come from in the world. So I'm looking at ethnicity as well, and seeing some interesting things come up, but I'm still in the analysis stage. So this is very much sort of cherry picking things I've seen. Once I have fully analysed it and written it, I'll be able to say more.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, I look forward to hearing that. Sorry, I think I cut you off, Rob. Was there something you were going to...
I thought you were asking me. I was going to feed in that 25 years ago, males of all ethnicities, most of the ones that were ringing the kind of advice line that I set up on a mobile phone and a leaflets and stuff, most of them were white. And when you mentioned counselling to them, they were kind of in their late 30s to their 60s, was, I don't want counselling, mate. No way I'm having that. There was an instant response to it. Almost 99% was no counselling. So they were looking for something else. Now it's the complete reverse. Now when you get a telephone call or you get a communication, they are, before you can get, because what you were saying about not everybody needs counselling straight away, is this default now is that you must have counselling. And there's also another reality I think we're going to all have to face. I mean, I have lovely wishes for the Labour Party who is now in power, who is hitting the ground running, and I'm sure sexual violence, mental health issues are on an agenda somewhere, climbing very rapidly, because especially for young people. So I'm sure they're working out what they're going to do. But we're not going to see, we do 20, 24 sessions. Some people are doing 26. The most I could ever see it being funded to is 50. I can't see them going beyond that. In some special cases where you have very complex situations where people are in psychosis or they've kind of got lots of other stuff going on within contexts like drug and alcohol rehab spaces, then you may get more of that. And there is a kind of pilot going on in West Yorkshire where they're doing a stepped approach, which is kind of working. But that's 50. That's not more than 50. And then people might get people into longer term therapy beyond that if they need it beyond that. But that's so expensive to do that I can't see for the wider community. So it goes to a question that maybe we could go to now, which is, given that reality, that there isn't going to be this, in case of except in very specific spaces, mostly that'll be very, very complex secondary mental health spaces, where people need that, who have already been in the system often, looked after care, etc. They may not be the people going to university at this moment in time, though hopefully in the future those programs work and they will do that in many cases, but if they want to. How do we collaborate? How do we work together across systems? Because that's been the other issue that actually this new government, hopefully is going to start addressing, which is, everyone talks about collaboration and everyone talks about this, that, and the other. But actually, when you get to the front line of that, it really is people still protecting their own spaces for many reasonable reasons often. But they're kind of doing, it's a real collaboration of kind of working together to actually deal with all these issues. I think that's the new frontier. Yeah. Because I just don't think, no matter what growth is generated, no matter what money is borrowed, there are so many other issues that need to be dealt with, housing and all the other things that need to be sorted. While mental health, sexual violence in particular, will be a central focus of it, trauma-informed systems and all the rest of it. How do we work better, smarter together? I think that's the question we're all going to have to ask ourselves.
Yeah. I think I can only speak for me. I think I looked at our waiting list and I thought, well, we're going to need help with this. And not because, we're all, my team, we're all well-trained therapists. Actually, there's different needs here. And I think of me, getting into a working relationship with you, Rob, it started with reaching out. Sometimes you've just got to get out of your comfort zone. And it took me a while to get in touch with you because I was sending out emails to places and not just giving up at the first hurdle.
Sure.
I think it is right. Who is doing something well? So I think there's a bit of that. Who are the actual experts? And I sometimes think sometimes there's lots of training available, and there's a mixture of whether it's good or not. And I will leave that there. And I think when you get good training and when you get services that are really doing something good, it's either can we collaborate and we send students to you, or is there something that we can work together where we're gaining some of the expertise? So I think it is just that networking where the goal is we really want to do some work together. So that's been one of the things, and even it's not just in terms of universities with third sector, university with the NHS, but university. I just had a conversation with my counterpart in another university where we were talking about things that in our service we could do better that they were doing really well, and vice versa. And it's that collaboration of, well, you're doing something well, I'm doing something well, let's not hold on to what we've got, and be precious about it. Let's work together because everyone benefits from it. So I think it's that, let's go out and talk. What are people doing? What's going on out there? So I think it's really important to be able to do that.
So I think my view of it is that there is no single service, because we're talking in the context of sexual violence. So, and we're happily talking about, in this case, male and female survivors. So there is, and rape crisis are amazing. I'm a big fan of rape crisis. Gets me in lots of trouble with some male kind of sections of things because, but I'm a fan of what they do. I don't think they can do it all, though, and I don't think any service can do it all. And I think the reality is we need to, have specialist hubs, if you like, that are really like the heart center you go to when you're really, really ready for the heart surgery. You need the heart surgery. They're specialist sexual violence services. But the rest of, the GP surgeries and everything else should be able to work with people who don't necessarily need surgery at this moment in time. What they need is to be well managed and help to kind of mitigate certain kind of presenting issues so they kind of lower risk. And then when they're ready, they might choose to have the heart surgery, which is going to, it's probably not a very good kind of analogy, but but it is about, it is, isn't it? Because really what you're dealing with trauma is you're dealing with betrayal, you're dealing with loss, you're dealing with grief, you're dealing with a sense of yourself not being valuable, not human. All of those things are kind of running, cascading through people, even if they're not aware of it. And, so the specialists are just very good at navigating those conversations with the client every day. And if they're really professional, they do all the CPD and all the rest of it. And they're always checking themselves in, because I don't like the word expert, because I'm a specialist because that's what I do all day. But I'm kind of learning every client that comes through the door, because I think I know what's coming. And actually, there's so big, and I think, well, I've not heard that before. I've never seen it kind of explained in that way. They're different because everyone's a human being. So I think collaboration is kind of knowledge sharing, doing what you do. So it doesn't mean everybody does it, but it means that there's a kind of understanding about holding people, which I think is what you were talking about at the very beginning, that everyone sends you to this kind of box and says, fix them. And actually it's not a box, it's a community. One of the biggest university populations anywhere in the country outside of London or Birmingham, Manchester, we are a big hub for universities. And then it's kind of, you've got the stories of survivors emerging here like nowhere else particularly, though they're kind of, in some ways. So this is the place to start collaborating and to start doing it differently. So we share the knowledge. So collaboration. And within that, training. So perhaps that's another conversation we have about training. Yeah. What is it especially with trauma, we're kind of, everybody should be human centered. I like Rogers. He didn't actually apply it himself particularly well when you watch the videos, but it's kind of, it's not an ideological religious belief is person centered. It's really a kind of method to, in my view, to be the foundation of all the other things that you will do, which is to kind of make people feel safe, really.
That's interesting. So I think, because I'm thinking in terms of collaboration, what's really important. One, I like that it's not about being an expert; it's about specialism and actually what do people do and what do I do well and what do other people do well. Um, and then you mentioned the other thing. Something I'm really passionate about is training. Part of the reason, I've done my psychotherapy training and I'm doing a master's in psychology and I plan on taking it further to do a doctorate. And the main reason is I take training very seriously. I want to be able to help and I want to be able to do right by any clients or patients or anyone that I work with. And that doesn't mean you don't have to go and do what I'm doing. But I do think as a profession, we need to be training ourselves well. I do think there is something about being trauma informed and how that works and understanding how trauma affects people. And if we're talking in the area of sexual violence, there is a shattering of the self. And often not only is there a shattering of the self, but there is shame, as in, it's my fault the shattering happened. So how do we work with someone where there is such deep shame? How are we going to help navigate that? And I think training and the desire to be well trained has to be at the center of what we do as therapists, what we do as sexual assault advocates. And when I say training, that can mean knowledge. So not everyone is going to be doing the one-to-one face-to-face work, but if you're advocating, know the statistics, know what's going on locally, know what support there is, connect to people. You talked about it, the experts are the people with lived experience. Are we listening to them? That's part of the training as well. I wouldn't consider myself a person-centered therapist. I struggled with Rogers, and not in terms of, there was things that I thought, yes, actually, there is about building a therapeutic alliance, but there's some bits I was like, it doesn't sit naturally in how I work. But I think there is something about that active listening, and there's something about unconditional positive regard that I wouldn't normally agree with, but when it comes to trauma and it comes to sexual assault survivors, I think it's crucial, because if you don't give unconditional positive regard, shame will always creep in. And so how are we being trained in that? Or are we inadvertently re-traumatizing people or shaming people, which then buries everything even deeper? So, yeah.
And I'm taking what you're saying there. I'm exactly on the same. Rogers was, talking about very useful kind of conceptual idea of what it is to be human. But you should be human anyway,
Yes.
shouldn't you, really, with your clients?
Yes.
And with trauma, if you do not have, you're not rich, so you can't buy 5 years of psychoanalytical theory or therapy or whatever you want and go through different therapists because you can afford to do all of that. You're going to have to take what's available, really. So then the responsibility for those services, whether they're delivering 12, 20, 24, 64, is the therapist, in my view, need to be well trained. The issue has been for services, for logical reasons, including you'll see that within your own service, is having the money to actually invest in your therapist in a way that is real beyond the odd day CPD year and all the rest of it. Actually having a 10, 20-day course that people can get a diploma from, so they can get I don't need to have a degree in trauma therapy, but have a real kind of focused training course where they can learn how to apply the theory. In the case that we use would be Herman's 3-stage theory of trauma with support. and kind of then use the integrated toolkit. So those two things are quite easy for people to understand. What's hard is for therapists to know how to apply it consistently. Because if it isn't applied consistently, we can never measure what the real outcomes are because people have been doing it differently. So you're still applying yourself and you're not an automated machine, but there needs to be a consistent approach. And that's what training does, isn't it? It allows you to deliver a consistent view of how to apply your box of tools within a framework, which is Herman's model framework, and then we can see, and there's going to be variations with individuals. So you can still use yourself, as Rogers would say, but you've got a toolbox called the integrative toolbox, but you're applying it on a consistent basis based on evidence knowledge about what actually works in the application of the toolbox within the framework.
Yeah.
And some people get really scared about it, and they think, well, that's kind of limiting me as a therapist and stuff and that kind of thing. And I said, well, therapy isn't your domain. It's kind of has to have a purpose. There's a purpose that the person wants something, so they need something. So you need to understand what you're giving to them and be able to understand it without being pure CBT. It's about, you're an asset to them. You're not kind of there to have this wonderful bubble of relationship. That's great if you can do that, run over the stuff, but you've got to work with them to get them back in the river of life. That'd be my philosophy about it. And it's kind of, that you're using all sorts of things, but it has to have a consistency.
And I really like what you said. And I think a friend of mine in the States, he is a social worker and he's a psychoanalyst and he's a DBT therapist. And one of the things that I've really taken from him, and he was sort of speaking my language in some ways, was it can sometimes feel that I think when integrative therapy is done well, it's great. Sometimes, if we're not careful, it can feel a bit pick and mixy. It can feel a bit hodgepodge. And actually, we don't know enough about each of the modalities to be able to use them effectively.
Indeed,
and I've listened to Jonathan Shedler on a number of things, and one of the things he was talking about was research. I think the other issue we have is research. What is evidence-based therapy?
Indeed.
What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What's the evidence that it works? So, and I think when you're talking about using something consistently, if we use it consistently, we can then measure, is this effective or not? So what's interesting, I'm trained in DBT. I did a proper course to be classed as a DBT therapist. And one of the things with DBT, you either do the whole thing or it's not DBT. And that's how they are able to measure this works. Because if you move from it, then you don't know if it's a DBT or if it's the thing that you've added in. So I think it's like anything. If you know something really well and you're able to use it consistently, then you can start to weave other things into it because you understand what it is and you understand what you're bringing to the client. Because at the end of the day, it's not about me looking good. It's about the client. What does the client need? I could be the best therapist in the world, but if it's not helping that client, it's useless. It's got to be something that the client's getting something out of. But I really liked what you said about applying that framework consistently. And I think sometimes, you've said it, we get a bit funny, and I don't know why, when actually all we're going to do is prove what we're doing works. And therefore we have evidence to take to the government, take to the people with the purse strings to say, here's the data, this shows it works, give us some money to help us. We can do all the lovely work that we want and we can help as many people. But if we don't have evidence, the money's not going to come in, which can then pay for more of that wonderful work to be done. And we have to be strategic and smart about that as well.
So Neve can talk about the recent data return she just did for the Ministry of Justice. who's kind of gives anybody therapist who's kind of not who's in a belief that the government is just going to hand the money over because you happen to be a very nice therapist, and that's fine. They're going to give you all this money. That world is not coming. They're gone. The world that not need will tell you. But the world that's coming is data driven, and it doesn't mean to say losing the human element of the counselling. It's just if they're going to pay £2,500–3,000 per package of counselling, they want to know that it has an outcome that's worth the £3,000. That's the bottom line about it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the data return I had to do was so detailed, and it took a lot of time. But it's kind of it can be a bit of a not a disadvantage, but a drawback in that it needs to be evidenced so meticulously to kind of get the funding in the first place. But at the same time, I do agree that there's that kind of, you owe it to the clients that you've got to make sure that also the service that you're providing is worthwhile and is actually there to help people as well too.
I mean, does it work? I mean, this is going to surprise you, but I've been doing this for 25 years, and I am a survivor, and I'm an activist, and all the rest of it. But Neve will tell you that I asked the question, well, does it work? So I do all this, and I've created all this stuff. I kind of think it works, because I believe it works, because I've done it, and I've seen and listened. But actually, do I really know it works? Because do we follow people
I think it's like
6 months down the road, a year down the road, 10 years down the road? I kind of know what I think happens, but I don't. No one's ever done that piece of research. I think that's on its way. Is the longitudinal stuff, because I think we need to do that as well.
Yeah, and there's an accountability to it as well, isn't there? Because at the end of the day, it's people's lives, and I think that's where as well the kind of knowledge exchange and stuff that becomes quite integral too, because that's how you hold other services accountable as well. I mean, there's obviously so many ways that you can deliver a service, and rightly so as well, like you said earlier, Rob. I think it is important to have different services offering different things, because it's not linear for people. They do need different support, but at the same time, kind of knowledge exchange and making sure that services are holding themselves accountable and other services if they see that they're kind of lacking somewhere.
Yeah.
Because it is people's lives that we're dealing with at the end of the day.
And not to be precious.
Yeah.
Like, at the end of the day, in my private practice, if I get a referral and I think this person's not right for me, but you know what, I know Joe Bloggs, who is perfect, I'm not going to go, well, if they get that client, it's a case of, no, actually, I've got to think about this person. That therapist is great, go work with them. Or I know a great service, and actually we've done all we can, and we're not specialists in this area. Let's work together, and we'll refer you on. And to go back to your point about the detail of some of the data that you have to send, I think you can argue. I think sometimes some things are asking for too much data, but I think as a profession, we haven't done enough data research over the years, and it's why I think sometimes we can't evidence the good work that's being done because we can't prove it. And I think, I'm thinking back when I worked at Leeds College, I was doing a piece of work. I was working with some international students, and a lot of them had experienced a lot of trauma. So I come from a pensions background. I came from sort of client-facing background and producing reports. So I was like, right, okay, I think something needs to happen. So I collected data. I collected just information on the students I was working with, the kind of things that I was seeing, and I then sent it to the leadership team and said, the model for therapy for these students isn't appropriate. Here's the evidence to prove it. They had the evidence. They had my word. They were able to produce jobs where they could get trauma specialists to work with these students. because our model of therapy wasn't right for them. I think there needs to be that sort of attitude to say, what is needed? What's the evidence? How are we working? Where's the evidence of that it's working? And more of that. And I love that you guys are doing that, and that's why you're getting the funding that you get, because you can prove this works, and so people are happy to give you money.
Well, sure, they're happy to give us money. There's always a difficult line. But the accountability thing, I think, is really interesting in therapy, and the going forward in collaboration and training I mean, therapists I don't hear that. I never hear that. I've done a BSc in counselling theory and psychology, a master's in counselling theory and practice, and I never heard the word accountability. There was never accountability. You hear it in clinical psychology, you hear it in psychiatry, where the clinician has a responsibility and accountability for their practice, and you get ethical frameworks within counselling. Where I've always heard therapists say, well, when the client leaves, because I've had the conversations that we're having about kind of what happens afterwards, what happens a year down the road, what happens 10 years down the road. Sometimes clients come back, most of them don't. So is that because your service was rubbish, or is it because they've kind of grown and developed, and I like growth theories? But we don't, but the therapist is always passing the responsibility on to the client. And I think, yes, the client is responsible for their own growth. But if you've done the wrong modality, if you've not delivered it well because you thought you'd read the information, you've not done the training, is it their fault that it doesn't work for them? Or was it your fault? But it's always their fault, because it's always the client who has to do the work. And the therapist always gets to say that I've done my bit. And sometimes I think you've done your bit because you think what you're doing is right, but do you know it's right? Because you looked it up and checked it? Those are big questions, aren't they, in counselling? And in trauma counselling, especially, you need to be not dictatorial. It's not a prescription, I tell people, our therapists. We're not prescribing a treatment. What we're saying, here's a framework, here's a toolkit called integrative that you can use. So we're not saying use one of the tools and none of the others, but you really need to know how to use the tools. And that's your responsibility. So you're the one who needs to go and make sure if you're going to use those tools, that you have gone and learned how to use them properly. And then you deliver those tools in that particular space for that particular time. So I think that's really, I don't think there's anything particularly onerous in any of that, to be honest with you.
No.
I think that's professional.
And funnily enough, with DBT, once someone has been assessed and they've been assessed to be eligible and DBT being right for them, if someone leaves, if a patient or a client leaves, it's the therapist's fault. That is because it's a case of, what did you do to cause them to leave? What did you not do to keep them in? Because we've done the assessment, they have the ability, they have the will. So what did you do wrong? And when I first heard that, I thought I didn't like that. I was like, oh, but actually, what am I bringing to the table? And am I listening to the client? Am I just giving worksheet, or am I listening to them and going, oh, actually, you know what? They're telling me this is too much. Okay, let's slow it down. Let's pivot. Let's do something else. Let's work with the client in a way that this can work. And I love that about accountability, because in our profession, it should be that you're getting better. But we still have clients that we worked with earlier on, when we didn't have as much knowledge. And, I'm hoping I've never put anyone off, but I'm sure there are some clients that I worked with who thought that wasn't the best experience. And my goal is to constantly, and that's why I'm training in the way that I'm training, to be, there's clients I think, if I'd known this then, I would have done this. If I'd known this, and that's what accountability is, being accountable to myself to say, if this is a person-centered work, I'm a person. So what am I bringing to the table for this client? What am I giving? What am I bringing? So yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, and that, going back to the reality, is funding is coming. I will be gobsmacked if there isn't a massive shift, an increase in mental health funding, and especially a focus on sexual violence funding, both in the criminal justice system directly and in the ancillary support systems that enable people to transition through those systems if they wish to, and also to receive therapy, regardless of where they are in it, because it's just a scandal, and it has been a scandal for decades, that those haven't really existed. So I'm sure I'll be amazed if that isn't happening. But you're going to have evidence, because that's the new government is all about evidence. They're all about kind of what works and what doesn't work. And so we're going to have all of those conversations. And I think they're a wonderful conversation because I think it does work. I actually think we know it works. We just don't know how long it works outside because no one's done the research. But I suspect research, if you do it on a big scale, would tell you that it actually does really work and change people's lives. It's still tough. People still have to kind of go through life. And trauma growth is not a kind of magic process. It's a struggle, but at least you have the skills now and the knowledge to make that work better. So I'm optimistic about collaboration and all its difficulties and in system change to trauma informed. In all the pushback that comes from a system in itself is traumatized after 14 years of austerity, plus all the inbuilt resistors to change because of status quos and all the rest of it. That actually we're moving to a place where we're all going to be healthier and the world's going to be healthier, and especially in each generation, because they're more open to kind of making sure their mental health is looked after, in my view, even though sometimes they don't know where to go to find that kind of place to make that work for them. I don't tire talking to survivors. People, I think therapists who kind of say, well, I've never burnt out talking to survivors, burnout talking to funders, but I've never burnt out talking to survivors because survivors, every time I speak to a survivor, no matter how complicated the situation they find themselves or the psychological distress, I find it amazing that and I'm a survivor myself, but I find it amazing how they have the energy and the courage to kind of seek to move beyond it, to find a way out of it. And I think that it energizes me every time I speak to one of them, because I feel, that's the hope of it, is human beings want to rescue themselves and they just don't know how to do it. And I think that's what the services should be doing, is really be energized by the power of humanness, the ability to kind of want to be beyond it all and to live a good life. That's what we should be here for.
I think on that note, that's probably a good place to end it, actually. Nice little final message there, Rob. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've learned a lot listening to you guys, so it's been really nice. So thank you both for joining, and thank you to anyone who might listen in.
Hopefully.
Thank you for having me. I had a lot of fun. I enjoyed that conversation.
It's been a really cool conversation, and we shall call it a day.
Yeah.
Till next time.